the December webinar series. We got Heather Noggle joining today. So excited to really transition a lot of these webinars to the highly technical setting focused, which you were a guest on. Thank you for that. To now more broader topics that I feel the industry doesn't always highlight as much as we can. And today's topic being communication. Heather, you started as a friend in the CIS working group. Literally, you were like a facilitator in that room. So there's no one better I could have invited to do this episode with.
Thank you, Zach. I had a grand time there, and I'm sure we're going to have a grand time today as well.
Yes, and I will do my best to keep my kitty at bay, but he has been an absolute nuisance all afternoon. But we will dive into it. So, Heather, before we do get into it, I look to you as very much an SME on communications, and honestly, you have an incredible writing style and your own LinkedIn blog series and all of this just things, I guess. You're very, very good at keeping up with all of the communication, writing style, and so forth. Do you mind just giving a quick introduction of yourself and specifically that background as to why you really are, in my opinion, an expert on that communication side?
Sure. My name is Heather Noggle, and I have a long career. Most of it's been in technology. And I started in human resources, went to college for communication after being a music major for a while, deciding that wasn't for me. So communication seemed like something I could do pretty naturally, and hey, I'm in college, I should probably finish that with a degree in something practical. So instead of doing a writing degree, I stuck with communications, which is a business writing degree, and I enjoyed it. I did well with it. And walked out of college and had no idea what I wanted to do with that. So what do you do when you have no idea what you're going to do? You just delay it. You go to grad school. So that's what I did. I moved to Columbia, Missouri, which is where Mizzou is, and went to school there. I had no plan whatsoever. I just showed up with no job. And I'm like, here, I'm going to live here and go to school. Anyway, so that's a little bit about my personality. I have gotten older and wiser and had a nice, good, long career, and then started, as I mentioned, human resources, and getting back to that. And my first real job in human resources, I was interviewing people all day long. And so I have thousands of interviews under my belt, and the idea of asking questions to get the answers you're looking for and to see whether people can interpret what you're actually asking, because a lot of times it's not in the words, and we're going to get into that because it always goes best when you're trying to communicate with someone directly that what you want is in your words, but in an interview setting, not necessarily.
Yep.
So that's a little bit about my background. We can talk tech a little later if we want to. This is more of a communication thing, so let's stay
Yeah.
on that track.
You definitely do have a technical background as well that you've dove into with everything you've been doing with the Missouri Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, if I got that right.
It is. It's a mouthful.
So very much happy to dive into that. And just as kind of a, I guess, preempt as to what really drove me and you to have this conversation, we did at Sention have the news about the release of our large funding round. So very excited to share that. It is going to be coming with some new hires. So talking to Heather and, just kind of brainstorming the best communication styles, looking at interns, full-time, part-time, and really just understanding those differences is something I look to you to talk about, and is likely something many MSPs out there or just general business owners may find value as well. So very, very excited to dive in today. And
Let's do
with
it.
that, we can definitely dive into that opening slide. So moderator, we'll kick off. But yeah, so we are going to be talking about the raw truths about communication, very much focusing on the aspects of, those interns, the hires, and really what it takes from that ground zero to, that long-term host. And there we go.
Hey,
We'll
there
get
we
this
are.
pulled up. There we are. So let's go ahead and open up with that first slide here, and we'll just kick off. During our little just pre-banter and just session formulating all of this, the biggest point on this first slide we'll pull up is this point about assumptions being what we said, silent killers. I was trying to make it a little bit dramatic, but you had a very sensitive point to, when you first bring someone on, you may in the interview process think they're ready to go out of the gate. They'll be self-sustaining immediately, right? And that's very much in its name an assumption. So why was this kind of the highlighted word for you? That's why I wanted to kick off with this word, because in our pre-interview, it was literally assumption, assumption, assumption.
So I like to look at assumptions as where we go when we don't know where to go, but we can't live there and just leave the assumption as an assumption. And so if we do that, that's where we make the problems. And a lot of old sitcoms like to split up the word and put a U in the middle of what an assumption will do to you. But the idea is when we get stuck, we go to assumptions just naturally as human beings. And if we take those and state them out loud, then they become conversation points and they're no longer assumptions. And they're then things we can clarify. In an interview process, you're looking to elicit as much information as possible from someone and also at the same time to learn how that person thinks. And so you want that person to make assumptions and state some things and be really good about being explicit of, here's your question, here's how I interpret it. Is that what you were looking for? And then you can build the conversation in the conversation. And so in either scenario, whether it's an interview or in team communication, we can't leave those assumptions in our heads.
That was a big point I wanted to call out, because I don't think we really took a step all the way back to say, is this part of the interview process as well, right? I mean, if you're already hired an employee, an intern, whatever, there's still obviously the interview process that goes with it. So that assumption aspect and getting the additional clarity is still important at that phase as well. So awesome to hear that. And, that is something we're actively looking at as well. So, the other big point, and I don't think it's very much talked about often, is this difference between interns and employees, right? I know historically when I was at school, a lot of internships weren't always paid. It's an honor just to be associated with that brand. You get a project, you get whatever responsibility, and you take it on. Now it is transitioning from what I've seen in the market where most internships are typically paid roles. And in some cases, from what I've heard from peers, it's basically a cheaper full-time employee. So kind of from your experience and your viewpoints on that, you said interns are not employees. Could you better break that down for me?
Your interns are still learning. And you are bringing on the intern as a favor to the intern and also in a very well-bounded project if you want to have a good experience. Here, intern, here's what you're going to be doing. Here's what we want out of it. And then based on the interactions you have with that person, you know how much autonomy you can give to that person. And so we can't make an intern work weekends and do these things and just use them as a low cost employee, because when you're interns, you have two purposes. One, you're giving the internship and then it's done. But the other thing the intern can do is go out and say, wow, I had this great internship with Sention. You have got to go and work there. And so those are some of the major reasons why we have to differentiate that this is almost like a contract employee. You're trying to impress and you're getting some benefit from this person, but you're also bestowing a whole lot to the person as well.
And definitely as a business owner, I want everyone who works with us full time to be those champions of our brand and want them to tout us. But to your response there, even interns may even be more so because they're intentionally not full time out of the gate and they will be leaving. There is a, deadline where they no longer have responsibility and they're going to be a no longer associated brand ambassador of their experience. So very much a little bit of a subtle difference there because, as an owner or their manager, you maybe don't want to take on them too lightly and, just influence them and treat them incredible just so they promote you once they leave. You still need to balance that good experience and looking at that next point, inputs and outputs, you still need to give them something to do and embrace kind of their skills and allow them to grow. So, we did talk about this input and output aspect here where interns very much should be treated maybe more like a contractor, something with a end goal, giving them pieces to perform a complete thing, as opposed to a full-time where you do get a project maybe without a deadline or maybe a looser deadline, right? There's a lot more responsibility. So as a, MSP, as a vendor owner looking to grow, bring on these hires, any experience or any story you can share where maybe the inputs weren't given and it became a challenge, or a good story where inputs were given and that a good output was achieved?
Oh gosh, we could spend an hour on inputs and outputs. I have this theory of inputs, outputs, and magic, just almost in my long career as a software developer. And so if your inputs are solid and you take something where you get a new project and it's a little scary, it's the size of a small city, And you need to get that into something that's workable. And so the progression of asking the questions, learning the things, and getting
Yep.
the what are we doing, why are we doing it, and what do we need to drive toward the output into the size of a small backyard. So small city where we could house 500,000 people to a backyard is where we want to go. Then we've got our inputs and we know what we're trying to achieve there. And so we also know the outputs. And then we take this and we say, okay, here we have a customer service program. We're going to do a help desk, and here's how we're going to be as a team. And here's how we're going to interact with our customers, and here's how we're going to act when they're frustrated with us, and here are the questions we're going to ask. And
Focusing
if
on
we
that
know the
culture input
person,
first.
the culture input, just since using your example, if we know the person because we've had several interactions, we may be able to shortcut. But until such time as we know the people we're dealing with, then these are the ways we're going to interact with people, and here's what we're hoping to achieve. You get to add your magic in the middle of how you interact with the person, but this is how you represent our company, and this is what our culture is. And so that's the idea of the inputs and the outputs. For software on help desk, we had a series of 6 questions we asked to get the bounding of the problem so that we're not spending a half an hour when we could spend 3 minutes, and then nobody gets frustrated.
Yep. And you kind of shared it's about making sure you understand exactly what the goal is. What's the size? Why are we doing this? When you gave those examples of questions, is that something you're encouraging the intern to speak up and ask, or the manager to bring up,
We left the
proactively?
interns on the last question, Zach. They're sitting over there nodding their heads at us because they just learned something. But yeah, it's more the idea of you have a process when you bring a new employee on, because you were talking about the applicability
Yep.
for an MSP. This is how we do help desk. This is how we do our in-person client interactions when we're talking about a new project. This is what we're hoping to achieve. These are the types of questions we've seen that our customers ask us, and here's how we respond to those. And so this is iterative, clearly. It's very
Yep.
agile.
And this process, as you just defined, is this something you would suggest an MSP, a vendor, whomever actually document and kind of have something to reflect on? Or is this just, intuitive? I'm going to get better naturally through trial and error without actually making a defined process?
You have to document at least the boundaries of it, because otherwise you don't have that backyard. Without documentation, you really don't have anything. Just like you can say you make backups, but if you don't test them, you don't really have backups.
I love it. I love it. So let's dive into a little bit when you don't actually have the right input. So this next point here, outputs aren't actually matching what you expect. So you feel like you have this process, you have all your inputs. I hired an intern to create a Discord community. I've provided them the inputs of the admin credentials, the ownership of this, and I let them run with it. But they ended up maybe doing something else. They didn't build a community. They built, a single channel about one topic instead of a broader thing. Just an example here, but how can an owner realize ahead of time if the inputs are not correlating to the right output? What kind of proactive steps maybe can a business owner do on this point?
Okay, you love this intern thing. Are you just going to weave this all the way on through?
I mean, we can talk about first employee. You're right. I should branch a little bit both.
All right, but the idea of you say community, maybe I see community differently. So if we're not going to define any deeper than the word community, we might have that mismatch, like you're saying. One of the talks and presentations I give talks about intergenerational workforce. And we often seek the same things across all the generations. There are 4 generations in the workforce right now, but the words mean different things. So the qualities behind the word respect mean very different things to, I believe you're in Gen Z and I'm in Gen X. So we might have a different way. And then if you put the generation ahead of us, they have definitely a different way of looking at what respect is. And so there needs to be another outline level down beyond I'd like a community. And then we have to define what the bullet points are to build that boundary, at least in the dotted line of what community comprises, to use that example. So yes, the mismatch in communication is usually insufficient, or there's those assumptions going in of, oh, here's what I think a community is. And obviously communication through, instead of just, here's your project, 3 months later, how'd you do? So,
Yep. And definitely, relating this back to, the hiring process of someone full-time, that defining community before you actually make the hire, because then you're retroactively saying, oh my gosh, that entire interview process, we weren't even aligned on the same outputs. They thought they were building it to do this when my intention was something completely else. So very much important, those assumptions as listed here, right? They can sabotage the entire initiative, right? You earn the budget, you're growing, you now know you need someone to fill this role, and you interview for months just to realize the person you went with isn't filling the need you thought they were going to. I mean, retroactively does not sound like the way to deal with something like that.
And it's both sides. So if you want to go back to like my ancient from the 90s communication theory books from college, there's a sender and a receiver, and you are both responsible for accurate communication. The sender has, I think, more responsibility, but the receiver needs to question and actively listen and say something doesn't line up here. And then these go back and forth just like packets. So
yeah. I love that one.
You're the sender, I'm the receiver, backwards, forwards. And in all of these interactions, we have a chance to clarify.
Yeah, and putting your HR hat here, when the prospect is asking those clarifying questions, and the questions that maybe before they ask think are obvious questions and too intuitive, like being on that interviewee side, you might be a little nervous to ask the dumb question. I want them to think I already understand. Any experience you can share on like what is the interviewer's take when clarity questions are asked? Is that a huge plus? It's a moot point, like how, or is it looked frowned upon?
Oh, it's a good thing, but keep in mind if you are the interviewee, there's an intelligent way to ask a question too. You can tie it to something else and give a scenario, and then build something elaborate and say, here's what I'm seeing. I'm going to give you an analogy, a scenario. Is this accurate? Where is it not accurate? And then it's not just, can I confirm this thing I'm thinking in my head that might be dumb? Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely that fear there. So, this kind of transitions into the next point where I really wanted to dive in now that we've set the stage, is getting into the actual conversations piece of it. So, we'll continue with the scenario here. Bad assumptions have been made. Clarity questions weren't asked in an appropriate time. So looking at this next point here, hard conversations that can work, right? I know in our pre-interview, we talked about some hard conversations being prepped the wrong way, right? There is a wrong way to talk about sensitive things. There is a right and wrong in this aspect. So this was something where you really leaned into, it's scenario based. Everything depends, just like cybersecurity. It's going to depend on relationship, experience, role, intern, full-time. So a million things you have to take into consideration. But, I boiled it down to, rip the Band-Aid off or build up that conversation, just to try my best to make a little outline here. But, you've set expectations, some assumptions were made, and now you need to retroactively deal with a full-time employee who thought they were doing wonderful and realized they did something completely misdirected. How do you go about having a harder conversation like that?
So can we salvage what was done and just pivot it where it's a minor thing and we work on the communication? If that's true and we have to build, if we have to completely redo 80% of what was done, there's no way to do anything about that but we need to pivot. And here's what we need to do. And we don't have to say, and you did this wrong, and you did this wrong, and you did this wrong. The other really big circumstance where we have to rip the Band-Aid off is if we have to give bad news and it doesn't matter the reaction. If there's a layoff, if we have to fire someone, there is no building to that. It's disingenuous to build. So those are the only situations I can think of where rip. Everything else is where do we go from here, and how do we make the best of what is?
Yeah, and you mentioned you don't want to blame them, right? So a key takeaway for me in that, wrong project was completed, whatever, how do you avoid blaming the employee? That seems like a really hard line to walk, because ultimately, if the manager is mature and a respectable human being, they'll realize they probably didn't outline clear expectations. So it's probably on the manager, but at the same time, the manager also has people who he or she has to listen to. How do you take that conversation downstream and not blame your employee, but have like a positive connotation around it?
Might it be the next panel on the slide? We focus on fixing the problems and not on who caused them, because the cause of a problem, any human relationship we know is not 100% someone caused a problem. And there's always environmental factors. There's this, there's that. And right now, as you see this here, if we don't fix this mess of water coming in, we're all going to be drinking more than we need of that water coming out of that hose there. And so the problem is key. And in a situation where the problem is really very fluid like that,
Nice.
then you've got to focus on getting it fixed and the best first action. So we can talk about lessons learned later in some sort of retrospective and going through and how we might do that better next time. But right now, if we've got a problem and it's a problem we must handle now, it's a focus on fixing the problem.
I like that. So it kind I mean, just to kind of summary and if you do have a story to kind of go along with this, that'd be cool to hear your perspective there. But I mean, it sounds like, hey, bad output happened. There was a miscommunication somewhere. There was an assumption made, a lack of clarity, and now the higher ups, we need to solve the immediate problem, and you focus on that. Not that you're brushing aside what happened, but you focus on that, and then schedule an appropriate one-on-one formal time as opposed to just kind of offhand communications and potentially indirectly hurting feelings and making it an intentional talk, you'd say.
And I know all this from doing it wrong, to be fair. And most of us can say that. We do a lot of our learning about communication. You can do as much book study as you want. We learn the most things by where we've done wrong interpersonally. And so, yes, you're right. Bad news is not something, or a call out of something negative is not done in front of the team.
Yep.
Now,
And
in a very honest conversation where we're talking about how, as a team, we need to do better, we can talk about those things, but without ascribing blame. And that is hard because it's a very fine line, because the actions are tied emotionally to the person, especially if the person does not believe what he or she did was wrong. That's a
Yep.
whole other dimension we don't have time for today. But
we'll do it in a follow-up. But the other aspect I want to highlight here, obviously the graphic fixing the pipe is a whole team. Can a problem actually build a better culture? Is that potentially an opportunity for the manager to create better future outcomes?
we're all in business to solve problems, so as long as they're not including this giant leaky faucet, yes, the mid-sized problems can be great things for us to align and work on, especially if we didn't cause them. I've run into scenarios in business where we didn't cause a problem, but we had the power to fix it. And sometimes the clients think, because you have the power to fix it, we need you to fix this. And that's an interesting conversation in and of itself. Is, well, that's outside of our scope. And those are not words you can use with your client. So that's an interesting thing, and yet another topic we can go into when you run into that. Just because you have the power to fix something does not make you responsible for fixing it.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, I don't necessarily have my own story to share, but it's, I guess, kind of. I mean, I mean, I got story adjacent. I got story adjacent about anything. It's entrepreneurship. I've dealt with plenty of problems, fixes, team building. It's the way it goes when you have small resources and we all wear a ton of hats, right? When you're an entrepreneur or an MSP that's growing, making your first hire, right? All the processes, how things you want done, but without actually outlining the plan or outlining the procedures and having that documentation available per what we talked about earlier, who's being held accountable? You can't hold accountable to whatever your gut is saying. Your employees don't know your gut, your colleagues or co-founders, right? You don't always just instinctively sit on the same page, even if historically you guys do. It's important to identify that and then overcome it together. So love looking at a problem as a possible team building opportunity. So the last point here, you mentioned it a little bit. We don't need to spend too much time, but match energy to the message. You shared the worst case scenario. If layoffs have to be made or if someone is being let go, you can't do that with a smile. But if you do have a team project where a team member did miscommunicate and it is serious, but it's in front of others, you do need to present that in a different type of tone. So tell us a little bit about this energy comment you brought up, because you got customer facing energy, you got internal energy, you got bad, good. That's a deep bullet point here.
Sometimes we have to control a conversation, whether it's with a coworker or someone who reports to us or with a client. I've found that if someone is angry, that if I leave enough space for the person to talk, that will often diffuse itself. And then if I just get a little quieter and a little slower, but it's I'm not angry. that too, so it's not necessarily there's an equal intensity or it's exactly the same, but sometimes it is. I had an argument with my 16-year-old and he was screaming and he wouldn't listen to me kind to calm him down, so I got in his face and I wasn't angry and it was really funny and I just started screaming at him and he shut up. So, you have to read the situation. And I couldn't laugh either because that would have destroyed it.
Right.
But
It would have
in the
diffused your
moment,
seriousness.
he needed to feel like I was hearing him and not trying to control him. It's like, I hear you, and I'm screaming, I hear you, I love you, and it fixed it. And you
So you
can't
very
tell
much
a client
matched that.
that.
Yeah, you very much matched that energy, and it was, heard a little bit better, even if your words didn't match the energy you were portraying. It still was heard better and absorbed a little bit more. So that's a very interesting example you gave.
It has to be you, and it has to be real, which is where I want to leave that point.
Yeah, definitely so. So let's keep going. We're about halfway through, and we're right on schedule with halfway through these
Awesome.
points here. So, the other piece of this energy, right? You have that customer energy, the internal energy, and that really goes into the communication style. So an aspect we talked about is with every situation depending, it's so hard to have a uniform process of, you know, communicating with one employee versus the other. The example me and you fell on was you may have the best help desk employee who's incredible at support via email. You put them on the phone and they forget how to log into their own computer. They panic, right? So very good in one, bad in others. It could be vice versa. It could be a million other things. But what responsibility does the manager have in trying to play towards communication style strengths?
Sure. I did give an example of that. I had an engineer I worked with for many years, over a decade. Fabulous engineer, very good one-on-one with someone he knew. Does not want to be on the phone with the customer. So in the event where I needed him to be on the phone with the customer, I would always preface, thank you for doing this. I know you're not comfortable. You don't have to say much. I do need you here for this reason to do this thing. And here's the outcome we're going to get from it. And I won't do it to you unless I have to. And it wouldn't have been in his job description of you're going to be working with customers all the time. And so it's an understanding of you're doing me a really big favor here because you were the right person for this moment in this job. And we lost Zach. Or me. There you are.
It was me. I got a screen, but
Okay.
I don't know why. It should be all good.
Again. So
I will refresh.
If this continues, just know I'm gonna have to communicate over myself, and that's kind of funny. So if I have funny looks on my faces, it's because I can hear myself talking over myself. We'll get Zach back in a minute. I can tell you all sorts of Zach stories right now while he's
All right.
I can tell you all sorts of Zach stories right now while he's gone.
Is my echo gone?
No. It's me echoing.
Lovely. No, I'm sure it's me based on the issues earlier.
We're having communication issues.
1 second.
And we can make that work if we have to. We just won't be able to talk about it as much. So I'll just pause and let him talk, and then I'll talk over myself, and then Zach can talk again. And we could tell jokes. At any rate, I'll continue on here. The email piece of it, I'm a child of the internet. I'm much more comfortable in email or in talking to a group rather than putting, if you put someone in a group of people that person doesn't know, that can be really uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me anyway. So if there's a room full of people, they all know each other, and I walk in and I've got to introduce myself, that's uncomfortable. So each one of us has a different way we interact with our comfort and communication, and some of us are really good with email and not so good verbally, and vice versa. So I just taught everybody everything while you were gone, and I am still echoing.
Okay.
It'll be okay.
Not sure. So other half.
We'll just pause, Zach.
All right. So sorry about that, and hopefully it stops on its own. I can't even change ports while I'm live on air, so that's a beautiful thing. Okay.
I've already talked through the email rock stars and the verbal flops, and that we all have different communication styles and things we're comfortable with.
Perfect.
I think that's better.
Oh, okay. I'll mute myself when I'm not talking. Sorry, audience, and sorry, especially Heather. Perfect. So given we've covered that first point, so the other piece me and you dove into, definitely being in the security world. A lot of the trade show events and in-person events typically do hover around social areas, the bar, the restaurant, whatever that is. And you may be bringing your employees to a show. So this could be the engineer who maybe wasn't the great verbal communicator, but they have a very high responsibility being at that show and building those networks. How can an individual potentially increase self-awareness, or how does an owner or manager better preempt that, difficultiness of their skill set?
Well, you and I have talked about this. I don't like being the person in the room where everybody knows each other and I don't know anybody. And so the person who is somewhat introverted like that is going to have the same sort of feeling potentially of I'm a fish out of water here. And so buddy up with somebody there. You don't bring that person and say, here, have fun at the trade show. But you can bring someone else the person knows, and then there's suddenly two of you against the world. That's a little better. And the idea of self-awareness that we talked about is there are two different types. This is coming from a book by Dr. Tasha Eurich called Insight. And I got to see her speak live about 7-8 years ago, and maybe a little bit less. She talks about there's two types of self-awareness. One is internal, where you know yourself and you know what's important to you. And so you're self-aware about that. Like you could be very self-aware that you really don't want to be at this trade show by yourself doing this. But there's also external self-awareness. You may have zero idea how other people perceive you. You may perceive yourself really well, but be absolutely negligent in understanding, oh, she's too over the top and needs to dial it back a little bit. And so both of these are types of self-awareness to learn about, and the book does a really nice job giving you a chance to do that exactly. And I think a story where I wanted to go with the self-awareness piece is within the book. It talks about everybody believes they're above average. So can we all possibly be above average in every skill? And if we really start to look at that and deconstruct it, that's a piece of internal self-awareness of, no, I'm not above average on absolutely everything I touch. So, did you catch any of that, Zach?
I caught all of it, and hopefully my audio is a little bit better.
Okay. I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not hearing myself over that.
Awesome.
We have overcome our communication issue.
Absolutely incredible. I had to unplug my microphone dedicated to doing webinars, and am using the microphone on my camera because that is the way technology works, and hopefully I am heard. All right, so very much, and just to kind of share my own story here with that trade show example, being new to the industry, right? Sention, myself, didn't have a proper background in the managed service provider market. So going to shows like IT Nation, going to Pitch It, being part of these events was brand new to me, where I was the new guy. And it was, even for me, an extrovert who enjoys this type of stuff, can be a little overwhelming, right? Not being the most, I guess, aware of what kind of mentality do people expect. Do they want someone who engages and makes jokes, or do they want someone to be more technical in person and stand off to the side, let people approach them? And something I had to learn very quickly is when we're at shows, it's really not there to talk tech. Unless you're on the showroom floor, it really is being able to communicate just with each other on a human level more than a professional level. So,
Relationships.
Yep. So to this point, just kind of wrap up this slide that I almost completely missed, is setting expectations with that new employee, that intern, whomever it is you want to join to an event, kind of sharing with them the expectation ahead of time, prepping them. I guess one other aspect to this point I don't think we mentioned, unless you did, self-awareness in the workplace. I know in-office jobs is becoming more rare. I think it's coming back a little bit. It's kind of a mixed split in the US right now. But self-awareness in the workplace, is this also something that needs to be acknowledged, or is this something you just kind of look away? They're meeting their objectives. They're doing all of the things I asked them to. So, I don't care if they don't talk to their colleagues or their colleagues don't interact. Like, at what point is self-awareness an issue internal at the workplace?
It's a big one because it's the core of your culture. So the idea of your external self-awareness, like you can't perceive how others perceive you. You think you're a good manager, for example, and your employees think you're a terrible manager. And if you're not figuring out the things you need to add to your skill in and noticing when your employees don't bring you things as a manager that they should bring you, that you're not leading properly, then you're missing the internal self-awareness to see how bad your external self-awareness is. That is another one of the things we could probably talk for a good hour on. So if anybody's interested in that, let Zach know. We can dig into the idea of the split between the two. And I do want to just reiterate that self-awareness amongst people and being able to speak up when they're not comfortable is pretty important, because anything we need to do is a skill. We can minimize how often we have to do it if it's deeply painful, though. Like public speaking is a skill, but a lot of people really don't want to touch that.
I think that's a point to call out a little bit more, but self-awareness you consider to be a skill you can improve? Or is that something
Yes,
that you're just born with or not born with?
it's improvable, especially if you split it and can see the difference between how you see yourself and whether you're clear on that, and then how you perceive others see you.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested to dive deeper into that, know some of those self-awareness trainings that maybe you have in mind. But no, that's a very good point. The last thing here with self-awareness, the inverse of that, the remote work culture. Is this as much of a factor there as well, or is this just important as a whole? Everyone needs to have good self-awareness. Like, is it less of a priority for a manager to notice virtually? Sounds like it'd be harder to notice, in my opinion.
There's still things that maybe not in communication as we are right now, but if a person doesn't turn in things on time, and that's important, and the person doesn't see that as important, we've got a communication issue. And if the person doesn't understand the impact, that could be a self-awareness thing of this really impacts the other person, and I don't see that even when the person brings it to me. Yeah, there's pieces to it.
Awesome. All right. Well,
Again, I don't want to go too much into the rabbit hole on this one because we really could.
Yeah. No, I mean, we can dive a little bit into this next slide here. And part of that self-awareness is maybe truly just alone asking better questions. We talked a lot about the assumptions at the beginning, but actually getting the full picture, whether it's an intern, new employee, an existing employee, assigning an individual task versus, I guess, showing the vision in my experience, or showing what the outcome should be from what, my experience working with my colleagues, has a lot more value to show the end goal instead of an individual micro segment of a task. So, if you're a manager today who really leads by, task driven priorities, you sounds like you have an opinion and it aligns with mine, but why do you see giving more and more context important? Yeah, I guess just leave it there.
It is really important, especially if you're doing something mundane and you don't know whether or not you have to do this mundane thing for a day, a week, a year. It's very important to say, you have to do this. Here's what it will enable, and here's the impact it will have toward the goal of XYZ, which are related to your vision and mission. So we see a lot, and I'm going to go a little bit off script here. Not that we have a script.
Not that we have a script. This is a live section.
I've had since we talked. So we see a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work done with the impact that you get from that. Especially, I like the intergenerational piece because it's very important in tech to get everything from everyone and their different work styles there. If we have to be aligning to get the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to align to mission and vision, and that goes back to clarity. Because the diversity is in, we have this common problem, and the diverse thoughts and the ways that we impact trying to solve it. And absent that, to have diversity for diversity's sake won't get you anything. So it's the same thing here. I'm going to bring that back. The context is important because we need people to be engaged, and they need to understand what they're doing. If you know you hurt your back and you know that you're going to be better in 2 days, you have a very different reaction to, I've hurt my back, when am I ever going to get better? So just to give you the idea of what context can do for you, even the worst thing you can endure for a while if you know it'll end.
Is it worth the manager's time to train their team to ask better questions? Is that something you can train your employees to do?
I think that you can. It's one of the core skills of critical thinking. And so critical thinking can be hard versus linear thinking, which is follow this path. But I think it is trainable because it's a skill. We talk a lot about soft skills in tech, and they are absolutely trainable. They just may not be easy. Just for the flip the inverse, if you find a true communicator, somebody who is very empathetic and really enjoys doing people work, and you say, go and configure this router, can that person do it? Yeah, it's a skill.
It's a skill.
But it may not be easy for that person versus someone else who just picks that up right away. And so the frustration, the same sort of frustration might be there in learning some of the sets of soft skills for people who genuinely either don't care about them until they find the context of why it would be beneficial, or just because it's uncomfortable. So context is really, really great in just about everything, even when you're raising kids, and it's more complex than clean your room so we can go get ice cream. But when you start with really young ones, you do something like that.
Yeah, you definitely begin with that incentivization process, but providing the context can help them better understand and, want to do it potentially on their own as opposed for just an award, right? And, the last point I want to really call out here is, we always say there's no bad questions. Us managers, owners, we always want more questions as opposed to less because that is the context. They're formulating and learning how to ask better questions when, appropriate. How do you get better at a skill? You practice. So, if you were to define a good question, are there aspects to it that it should have, something from my point of view, and I think I took away from our conversation is the questions an employee asks or an intern asks should ideally lead to an action or an outcome or relate it to an output. But any kind of input you can give on, aspects of a good question?
Yeah, I like the work backwards from a direct object. So a direct object is we're doing the thing to something. And so if I don't know the answer of you want me to do action X to Y, there's your context. So we start with the Y as in Y the letter, not WHY. So I made a difficult example there. It could have been XC. So if I know those two things, then I can go back to the context. And I have one more point I want to make on that. I like celebrations in a team. I think they're very important. And without context, we don't know what to celebrate. So if you have this finite thing of you're doing this thing to achieve this other thing, and when we get to this other thing, we can tie what we did to achieving this other thing, and then there's some closure there of, yay, I did this thing that was maybe not very pleasant, and it's done now, and it accomplished this, and without what I did, then we aren't where we need to be. So going back to that, the good questions will typically have enough context in them that you can tell what we're trying to achieve. And the yes, no questions really don't ever get you there. So in interviews, I sometimes say, can you tell me about a time you did blah? And the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, I could.
I can tell you that. And I know that's not, and you wouldn't do that because that's not what the person is asking. But when I teach people how to ask questions, especially in an interview scenario, we reword that to, it's not actually a trust, it's a statement. Tell me about a time when you did this, and then the question comes, and what happened after that?
Yeah, tell me about a time you took action to achieve an outcome, right? Describe that process, right? So it's very much an opportunity for them to share a story as opposed to just a yes, no. It's funny having these communication presentations and, just our interactions trying to better our own skills on this, because even though it may not be a sales role that we're talking about, we've used engineers as one example throughout all of this. A lot of these are sales skills, and a lot of the, methods we talk about here is a lot of what I do in my first round calls, my second round calls when I meet someone new to better understand, how do they view security? How do they understand what current security vendors they use? Do they think they even have a, missed opportunity in their security stack? Or do I learn that they have a really high ego that they think they're impenetrable, right? So asking questions to better gauge the type of person is very sales related, but per the webinar that we're working on right here, it goes well beyond just sales. And I think that's probably one of the aspects everyone says everyone's in sales.
There's one more piece to this too. When you ask a question, don't make it a paragraph. So if you're going to do a paragraph to set a scenario, do a paragraph and then ask the question at the end. So the person has, here are the things I'm thinking about, and then here's the question. Sometimes you'll hear, like, listen for this in a podcast where the person asks the question and then talks for a minute, and then you have to remember as the guest, what am I talking about here? Because we just went from Cincinnati over to Cleveland, and now we're in St. Louis, and I think you asked me a question about Cincinnati. It might have been Cleveland.
I have sat in on podcasts exactly like that. People tune into a podcast to listen to the guest usually, and the best podcasts have a great facilitator. So very much heard on that one. Now, the next point here is something you introduced to me. I hadn't actually heard of, but the laugh track theory. So, I hadn't heard of this. This was more completely from you, but humor and absurd communication, Heather. I mean, I forget why this even came up in our pre-interview. Okay. Tell us a little bit more on what this is.
There are some times in the workplace where someone says something that your brain says there is no way that person just said that, and yet it is so. And it can be so off-putting, so absolutely awful, and if you take it seriously, hurtful, that the only way to handle that is to pause and say, that's a sitcom. Put a laugh track behind it. And that's from that same book from Dr. Urich called Insight, is that's absurd, and so I should not take it to heart, and then we can move on from it. And sometimes you're going to be the person who says the absurd thing, especially in a family, hopefully not in the workplace, but sometimes things come out. And so the idea of the laugh track will diffuse it internally so that it doesn't affect you. And chances are the person is mortified, if the person has any self-awareness, that, oops, that just came out of my mouth.
Yeah, and it sounds like part of this was you already have the relationship. This is someone you already have a view on, someone you have experience with, and you're just like, that's probably not what they meant. And you toss the laugh track, and then, I guess in this scenario, is this something if it's in a group setting, is this something you still pause and just kind of acknowledge, or is this something you brush off and talk about later?
Probably brush off and talk about later, but you do make the pause so that everyone else can make that moment of, now we have to pivot off of that, even if we don't call it out of that's just wrong. So okay. I'm trying to think of the last time that's happened with a client before, where the client has said something and then, okay, that I can't let that. Okay.
Yeah, there's, there is a story that comes to mind for me. Senseion, we do endpoint hardening, and we do lean into some of our brand humor. But there's definitely sometimes on the other end, someone takes the humor too far, and you're like, all right, we gotta pause and get back to the topic.
Yeah, and that sometimes things are of that nature, and sometimes it's just. Yeah, well, again, a whole hour we could spend on the laugh track. The idea is it's for you, not for them, so that you are not offended. You're not taken aback. You can continue on and doing what you need to do. And there is definitely absurdity in communication. There's the good kind and the bad kind. That's the bad kind. The good kind can break the ice and really get you, if you are missing getting somewhere you need to with a client, you can introduce a little bit of absurdity in a good way. If you've asked someone, how does this next process work, and you can't get anything out of them, then you can say, okay, then the sheep comes up and presses this button. No, the sheep doesn't do that. Then Joe comes over here and he puts these two sequences. Yeah, there we go. Okay. And that's not offensive. That's just another way to introduce some clarity and have absurdity be a good thing. I'm a big fan of that, because I think that will alleviate some pressure of, I've got to come up with this answer right now. And then it's just a prompt.
Yep, very much. Well, coming into these last couple slides here, so we talked a lot about internal, a little bit about external, but a point that we did talk about was how that internal culture and that internal communication style is kind of what becomes the client tone. So, my role is very much focused on sales, go-to-market, marketing, but realistically it boils down to me talking to people outside of Senseion. Well, I talk the most to people inside of Senseion, and I develop my talking style based off of how I talk internally. So it really starts to reciprocate to how I talk externally. So tell us a little bit, your point of view, if you agree with kind of my experience, like how does internal communication start to translate to external client tone and relationships?
We spend a whole lot of time at work, so our culture is going to carry into our lives. The best example I can give is my father was in the military, and this is before I was born. It's a story that came down through the nation, or the nation came down through the family. That he came
Noggle
home,
Nation.
not he came home, young man, for the holidays. And I looked at his family, and it just came out. He said, "Pass the effing mashed potatoes." Military culture, right? You don't do that at home though. But
Yep.
it's gonna spill on out. If that's not the tone you want to have with your clients, then you probably shouldn't have it internally, because at some point, especially with long-term clients, we get very comfortable.
Yep.
I have some clients from my previous employment that were 20-year relationships. They're older than my kids. And so we're pretty comfortable together. When I get on the phone with them, they know what to expect and vice versa. And so we just get a little bit more comfortable, a little more relaxed. And that's a good thing, because we can then perpetuate those relationships even further. But something like that, well, that military culture came home, and that didn't work.
That one 20-year relationship, that basically becomes an internal relationship because you've been with them so long. But at the same time, mentally, maybe you are still viewing them, it is an external client, but I act internal with them. And then you might just get caught up in a first round meeting with someone new. Are there scenarios where you could see your comfortability with some of your long-term clients, trying to transition a new relationship too quickly and getting that internal style released externally in a negative way where it can actually hurt the starting of a new relationship?
I'm sure that's possible. From where I came from, our relationships were almost marriages, which is why we had the 20-year commitment. There were a lot of data integrations in place. And so we really, before we would commit to something, would know it'd be a long-term thing and that it had to be a fit. And so some of these things are 9, 10 months or over a year before we would actually get the customer. So I don't have a whole lot of experience in just assuming too much and being too familiar. I'm sure it happens though.
Yeah.
Just, assuming you've already got the sale and we're already doing this, and then, whoa, we're not getting married here. Yeah.
Yep. And, we're, going back to sales here, we're talking about clients and external tone. So, these longer relationships you built became like family, became like a marriage. It became that internal communication. So they always say people buy from people, or people buy from their friends, right? So this aspect of patience paying off, you are very much a believer that you don't need to close a sale in the first month to have a relationship. It is something that's ongoing that you really work on and grow.
Yeah, especially if you're looking at enterprise clients, understand you start with the stakeholders who may not be the decision makers, but they will be your champions to the decision makers. And I know it's always best in sales, find the decision makers, get in front of them. Sometimes that, though, isn't the right way to go. You have to win the hearts and minds of the people who will actually be using your software. And then they can take it and make the pitch to make the sale, to make the long-term commitment to continued use. So patience definitely pays off in that scenario. And also, you've got to stick with something you're doing long enough to prove it works or doesn't work anyway. And so that goes with people and communication style as well. And so, mirror your clients, I think, is very important. You have your ideal customer profile. Those are the people you're going to speak with and speak to. So that's what you're going to work with.
Yep. And, relating this back to, I guess, how we talked about full-time employees, interns, and whatnot, this aspect of patience, the example we gave was about sales, growing the relationship, longer sales cycle, but also to the engineers who aren't usually on the phone, or the support that doesn't typically have to talk to, or maybe they do via email, right? This is all types of communication that all pays off. So that person who struggles at first, working with them and growing that as a skill instead of getting upset and not helping, can potentially have a larger, longer term reward, as opposed to getting rid of them and starting new with someone who comes with those skills. So very much just wanted to emphasize the importance of internal training as well as that external sales process.
And for many things that we're uncomfortable with, if we do train them as skills, we become more comfortable over time. So I'll give the router example. You really don't want me configuring routers. I'm software geeky, not hardware geeky, but I could learn to configure routers and get good at it. And then I would be more comfortable once I felt I had a perceived competence to it. And our soft skills or communication skills can be the same way. They won't be for everyone, but they can be.
Yep. Absolutely. All right, we are down to the final point, and I like to end just with like the major takeaway I hope everyone has out of this session. But the unskippable rule of communication, this being clarity. So, just kind of summarize a little bit. We talked about assumptions being bad, good questions matter, but all of this really led to the point of having clarity between yourself as a manager and the new employee, or new employee with the customer, or new employee with the manager, but clarity being kind of the theme of today. So, and I took this away from our conversation, Heather. So kind of your point of view, why did you emphasize clarity so much in our pre-interview, or any other stories you want to share here?
If we don't have common understanding, we're not going the same place. And we can work really, really hard, but if we're working against each other, or again, we're going to use Cleveland and Cincinnati again. If we're working really hard and you end up in Cleveland and I end up in Cincinnati and we're giving a presentation together and we don't have access to a telecommunications thing, hello, Kitty, then we're not doing what we need to do. I put my fur balls out, but yours is very sweet.
Oh, I wish I could get my fur ball out. I will note, not to ruin your closing thoughts, Heather, but to share the quick story. We finally found a vest that Bruno here can't escape, at least so far. So we are not training, he wants to do it, but we are learning to trust the vest so that we can put a leash on him so he can go outside and explore on his own, because he begs to go outside constantly and we just don't trust him yet.
The leash skill. You're working on the leash skill.
We very much are. But no, that is a very, very important point. Getting everyone on the same page and having that same, I guess, level of trust kind of goes into this as well with clarity.
Yeah, if you can be confident on what you're working on, that you understand what you're trying to do, then you can get there faster, better, and also not be second guessing. Is this really what this person wanted from me? That's the ambiguity. Anytime we can cut the ambiguity, we do better work.
I love it, Heather. Thank you so much for being the SME today. In this last slide, I want to give us both the opportunity, if there's anything you want to share that's coming up. I know on our end, we are participating in Ninja One's Festivus, I think is what they're calling it. We will be talking a little bit about some of these red team, blue team, and which settings are going to be the most impactful from the hardening perspective, as my cat walks all over my keyboard. But outside of that, we are sponsoring Right of Boom and MSP GeekCon, and looking forward to getting into that into 2025. But Heather, anything you want to promote or plug while we're concluding here?
Well, I think I'm wrapping up for 2024 and looking into what 2025 is going to bring. I'm trying to think. I get to attend IR games on Friday, so I'm not featured in that. I just get to attend, and I'm super excited about that, Bob Miller. And
I'll see you there.
And I know you'll be there as well, and so I'll heckle you and your cats too, and it'll be good. So yeah, I don't have a whole lot going on. I had a keynote last week, a virtual keynote, so that was kind of fun. And looking for more of that if people need that. So we'll see. 2025 is going to be fantastic, and very, very glad you invited me to do this, Zach.
Absolutely, and we'll be looking to hear some more of your talks going into the new year. And as a reminder for everyone, you can catch the replays of this on the Sention YouTube channel. And if you are curious to check out our hardening platform for workstation servers and browsers, you do get free assessments for attending the webinar today. So just sign up at app.sention.co and let us know. But let's go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, Heather, again, and look forward to the next session.
Very good. Thank you, Zach.
Awesome. I am so sorry about my